I'm going to talk about a proposal for a path to AI and a bit of an architecture, perhaps, and we'll address some of the issues of AI safety and things like that, but not too much. So how can machines be intelligent and beneficial at the same time? Basically, how do we build them so they do what we want? And, we probably want them to be more like 3PO than HAL 9000. There's a collision of the two worlds here. And so I'm going to start right away by kind of positing the architecture of an AI system. So this is nothing particularly new here, but an AI agent or an AI system is composed of essentially three basic modules. One is a perceptual module that essentially allows the agent to estimate the state of the world. Another one is the agent itself, which basically generates actions or action sequences that are going to act on the world. And the agent has an internal state. This internal state goes into some sort of objective that's kind of hardwired, if you want, built into the AI system, and basically tell the system whether it's happy or not. Think of it as a cost, an objective you want to minimize. And one of the things I'm gonna say is that the agent will have to be able to do prediction, essentially, to be able to do anything intelligent that will allow it to do planning, reasoning, have a working memory to enable it to do all of those things. And the objective will drive the agent to do things that we want it to do. And it will be composed of two components. So one component is immutable and hardwired, and it's basically a safeguard. It's the instinct of the machine, if you want, that sort of makes it, by default, do things that we think are good. And then there's another component which is trainable, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So what are the obstacles to AI? Or at least what's the biggest obstacle that I see? This is a very personal view. And how could machine acquire common sense, which is kind of one of the holy grails of AI that AI has never been able to reach. And the short story is that machines don't have common sense, and to acquire it, they must learn how the world works by observation and by action. And predictive learning is kind of the solution to this. So all of the successes that we've had with AI today are basically the result of supervised learning. We can, label images, we can drive cars, we can do all kinds of things. That's basically all supervised learning. There's been some success with reinforcement learning, but it's always in virtual environments or in environments where the data collection is such that you can have the equivalent of a very large number of trials. Supervised learning is really insufficient for real AI. And you can look at the animal world or humans. Most of what we learn in the first few hours, days, months, years of life by basically observing the world and acting in it and not being necessarily told the name of everything. Animals certainly don't learn this way. So, we learn very basic things like object permanence, the fact that when an object is hidden behind another one, it's still there. The fact that when an object is not supported, it falls. We actually learn this as babies between the age of 6 and 8 months, roughly. There's a lot of kind of the constraints of the world that we learn by just observing, and that kind of allows us to build a sort of internal model of the world. And we can use this model for prediction. That's kind of a critical aspect of it. And it's this sort of massive amount of information about the world that allows us to build common sense. So common sense that allows us to do things like, figure out lift the ambiguity in things like Winograd schemas, sentences like the trophy doesn't fit in the suitcase because it's too large, or the trophy doesn't fit in the suitcase because it's too small. In the first case, the it refers to the trophy. In the second one, refers to the suitcase. And we can figure this out because we know how the world works. Or we can also fill in the blanks. So if I say a short sentence like Mike picked up his bag and left the room, there's all kinds of events that you can infer that have to happen as a consequence of this description in the world because you know all the constraints of the world that the world has to satisfy. So how do we get machines to learn this? So common sense, you could think of it as the ability to fill in the blanks, which includes infer the state of the world from partial information, predict the future from the past and the present, predict the past from the present. That's useful if you're a police inspector, or if you want to figure out how someone arrived at a particular goal. And we do this all the time. Our brain does this all the time. We have a blind spot in our retina, and we're not conscious of it because our brain kind of fills it up. we can figure out, you might only see my left profile, but you can figure out what the right one looks like, more or less, because most people are symmetric. So all kinds of things of this type that we can predict, and basically our brains are prediction engines. And in fact, you could say that prediction is the essence of intelligence, really. So the necessity of unsupervised learning or filling in the blanks of predictive learning is a theme that has been recurring in machine learning for a very, very long time by a few people. At least Jeff Hinton has been sort of a big advocate for this for the last 30 years or so, if not more. In fact, more like 40. But using supervised learning is not enough. There's just not enough knowledge that's embedded in sort of labeled data for machines to really learn common sense. So in fact, you can sort of estimate really how much information you give to the machine when you ask it to predict different types of data. So in reinforcement learning, pretty much the only thing you ask the machine to predict, or the only information you give to the machine to let it predict, is just a few bits once in a while. Basically, you tell it whether it did right or it did good or bad. That's the reinforcement value. You don't tell it what the correct answer is. And so the amount of information you ask it to predict and for which you give it the answer is extremely small. And the result is that the sample complexity is ridiculously large. It means you need a very, very, very large number of samples for a pure RL system to learn anything, which is why it only works in virtual environments. But it does work very well in virtual environments. Supervised learning, you give a little more information to the machine, you tell it what the correct answer is. And unsupervised learning, said in those terms, is kind of vague, but predictive learning is you ask the machine to predict any part of the data it's not seeing from any part that it sees. And eventually it's going to see the part that it's not seeing at the moment, and then it's going to be able to adjust and predict. And that may consist of millions and millions of bits at every trial. And so that's the necessity for constraining sufficiently many parameters in a large intelligent system. So that led me to this slightly obnoxious analogy that pure reinforcement learning is kind of a cherry on the cake, where supervised learning is the icing on the cake, and unsupervised predictive learning is the bulk of the cake, the génoise, as we say in French, right? So unsupervised learning, unfortunately, we don't really know how to do properly, so it's like the dark matter or the dark energy, rather, of AI. In fact, it's dark when it's a chocolate cake. I should point out that I've been showing this picture now for about a year or so, and this is a Black Forest cake, and Black Forest cake has to have a cherry on it, right? The cherry is not optional. In fact, this is not a jab against RL, because we work on reinforcement learning at FAIR, but model-free RL works in game, but it doesn't really work in the real world, because you can't just, the main issue with the real world is that you cannot run it faster than real time, and so you can't generate lots of examples. So here is a partial hint to a solution, and that comes from Rich Sutton, who is here in the audience somewhere. And he said, he proposed this model called DINA many years ago, 25 years ago, and said the main idea of DINA is that the old common sense idea that planning is trying things in your head using an internal model of the world. This suggests the existence of a more primitive process for training things not in your head, but through direct interaction with the world. Reinforcement learning is the name we use for this more primitive, direct kind of training. And DINA is the extension of reinforcement learning to include a learned world model. So that's what I mean by what we should do. In some contexts, this is called model-based reinforcement learning, but you don't have to have reinforcement learning for it. It can be actually supervised, but the point is you have a model of the world that predicts things you don't observe. So this is actually a very classical way of handling planning in control theory, where you have a simulator for whatever system you want to control, and then you have an objective to minimize, and you kind of choose the sequence of commands that will optimize this objective. But you need this plan simulator if you want to be able to do this. So again, the architecture of an intelligent agent is kind of what I showed at the beginning, and it really sort of mimics a little bit how the brain is architected a little bit in at least conceptual view. And now the question we can ask is, what is inside of the agent? And what's inside the agent is, you have to have this world simulator that sort of predicts what's going to happen in the world, just because the world is being the world, or because as a consequence of the actions of the agent. inside the agent, you have what I would call an actor, which is sort of a standard name for this in RL as well, which is sort of a module that generates action proposals that are sent to the world simulator to see what the effect of them would be. And then there's a critic, which is basically a predictor for how the objective function is going to end up, where it's going to end up if you do this sequence. So it's sort of a trainable part, if you want, that tries to kind of predict sort of a long-term expected reward, if you want. So we know how to build pretty much all of those things. We can do perception pretty well. You know, the actor and the critic and the reinforcement learning type things that are done for this are relatively well understood, but what we don't know how to do is the world simulator. So in a typical run, the system would get a percept and then generate a sequence of action proposals, run the world simulator to see what the result is, measure the expected error using the critic, and then adjust the sequence of action proposals to kind of optimize this, and then sort of train itself to produce it directly as time goes by. So here's the big problem. How do we learn predictive models of the world? So there's a number of experiments that have been done in various places, in Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT, for example, at Facebook by some of my colleagues, Adam Lehrer, Sam Gross, and Rob Fergus, on sort of learning qualitative physics or intuitive physics by kind of training a convolutional net, essentially, to predict what's going to happen next in a simple kind of physical situation, training it using 3D game engines. So, for example, predicting where a bunch of blocks are going to fall, et cetera. And it works decently well, but the question is, you know, how do we make this kind of more general? So, for example, how do we train a system to predict video, what's going to happen in a video, perhaps in a few frames, maybe a second, a minute, or an hour from now? And if you do naive predictive learning using the same techniques that we use for supervised learning, so take a convolutional net, for example, look at a few frames, and then have it generate the next frame or the next few frames, and then train it using least square, what you get is predictions of the type you see on the left, where it's very blurry. And it's very blurry because there is no way you can predict exactly what's going to happen in the world. So the best the system can do in a kind of a supervised framework is to basically predict an average of all the possible things that could possibly happen, and what you get is a blurry image. So we need better methods, and I'm going to make a proposal for this. Or to kind of explain the difficulty of this, basically we need a new paradigm or formalism that would allow us to train a predictor in such a way that what it observes in the world is not the correct answer, but is one representative of a whole set of possible correct answers. So for example, if I put a pen on the table and I let it go, it might fall in one direction or the other, and it's very difficult to predict in which direction it's going to fall. But you can predict it's going to fall, that's pretty sure. And so the world is telling us this point, which is on a manifold of possibilities, and the system is predicting this, which is also on a manifold of possibility. We don't want to punish it for making the wrong prediction as long as it's on the manifold of possibilities. So the next question you have to ask is, what does this manifold of plausible futures comes from? And we have to learn it. And so the best idea for doing this is an idea that popped up in Yoshua Bengio's lab a couple of years ago by Ian Goodfellow, who is also somewhere in the room, or at least he was yesterday. Here he is. And I've said this multiple times, I'm going to repeat it. I think it's the best, coolest idea in machine learning in the last 10 or 20 years. And it's called adversarial training. Ian called this generative adversarial network. And the basic idea of it, in a kind of a simplified fashion, is that you take a few frames from a video, let's say, and you're going to train a generator, this green box at the bottom, to predict the next frame or the next few frames. And there's going to be another network, and this network is going to be this the network that tells you whether the point that's being predicted is on the manifold of plausibility or outside of it. Okay? So it's basically a function, a contrast function that produces a single scalar value. You give it a prediction, one of those points, and it tells you you are on the manifold of plausible predictions or you're not. And of course, this thing is going to get trained simultaneously with the generator. And the way it's trained is that you show it real-world occurrences and predictions from the generator, and you train it to discriminate between the two. So the real-world things are those blue beads. You train it to produce a low output for that. And then the generated samples, the predictions by the generator are those green beads, and you tell it, give a high value to this, a high cost, if you want, to this. And simultaneously, the generator trains itself to get the green points as close as possible to the area where the discriminator gives low cost. So eventually, you get this, where you get a contrast function, which is the discriminator function, and the generator trains itself to produce points that are in the values of that function. And I think it's a very cool idea. It breaks everything that, all the theories that we've done with machine learning in the past, because they all assume that we're minimizing a function, and here what we're doing is finding a Nash equilibrium between two functions. It's very weird mathematically, but it produces amazing results. So these are just completely generated images from random vectors. This is trained on ImageNet completely unconditionally. And they look like, if you're on the back of the room, they look reasonable. If you're on the front of the room, you say, what the hell is this? Because there is no actual recognizable object you can see here, but the statistics are correct. This is if you train on dogs, you get Salvador Dali dogs or something like that. Kind of soft dogs. So there's a lot of progress being made very quickly in those techniques. These are relatively high resolution images. This is the first time people have generated images of this resolution, 256 by 256 using GANs. Yoshua showed some results yesterday of another technique that uses adversarial training, but with another trick that also generates nice pictures. There's a lot of work in this area. I find it really exciting, and it's actually taking off like wildfire in the community. These are examples of video prediction. So on the top right is what I showed earlier. It's what you get when you train a large convolutional net to predict the next couple of frames in a video. Using least square criterion, so just get as close as possible to the real thing, and you get those blurry predictions. And the 6 other segments are predictions using adversarial training. So the first 4 frames are observed, are real frames, and then the last 2 frames, which are so-called in red, are generated. And it's kind of a decent continuation of the motions that you observe in the initial 4 frames. These are just 2-frame prediction. This is another one with 5-frame predictions. And here the task is we train the system with videos of someone kind of running around with a camera in various apartments in New York City. And we train the system to predict the next few frames. And here these are examples where the camera pans. And so what the system has to do basically is invent what the apartment looks like in places, after, as the camera continues panning. And, it's never seen this apartment before, so it's got to figure out, how to continue the aspect of the apartment. One good example is this one, for example. So it has to kind of dream up what the bookcases look like, or what this library looks like as the camera pans. So it works for 5 frames. Doesn't quite work for 50 frames. It degrades pretty quickly, pretty badly. It gets like really soft. So the real challenge there is how do we design sort of hierarchical versions of this that can do prediction at long term that kind of makes sense. That's what we're working on. Now back to the question of how do we design. How much time do you have?
Your time has just officially expired.
Okay, so that's pretty much my last slide. So second last. So the way we would design the AI system to do what we want and align its value to ours, there's 2 ways. One, we can hardwire a safeguard objective function, or maybe built-in instincts, if you want, that will get the machine to by default be social, etc., do what we want. But then there's a trainable part, because as Stuart Russell said yesterday, it's very difficult to actually kind of design an objective function and be sure there is no bad side effects. So we should be able to train the system also to kind of train its objective function. And a trainable objective function is exactly what adversarial training is doing. So in fact, there is a way to use adversarial training to train the objective function by what's called inverse reinforcement learning or imitation learning, where basically the objective gets the action for a particular context from the human trainer as well as from the agent, and basically trains itself to discriminate between the two, and the agent kind of trains itself to make its action as indistinguishable from the trainer as possible. And then eventually we'll arrive at its objective function that basically emulates the objective function of the trainer. So we have technical solutions to this. For once, I agree with Stuart. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Andrew Maynard. with this adversarial training approach, do you always get exactly the same output for the same input, or is there some degree of variation that sort of projects different possible imagined futures?
So really what the generator is a parameterization of this manifold of possibilities. And so the way you generate different points on this manifold is that you pick different values of kind of a latent variable that is called z in this case, which you can see as a set of parameters that parameterize this surface. In the training, during training, those are chosen randomly, but there are other techniques that people are thinking of where it's not random.
Jürgen?
Jürgen Schmidhuber from the Swiss AI Lab. I agree with much what you said there, and I see a problem, however, if you want to apply that to real-world settings, when you are trying to simulate the world, essentially. Because what you are trying usually is to simulate it millisecond by millisecond, so you have this recurrent neural network, which is the controller, which takes in all the data and then it translates it into action sequences. Then it has this little friend, which is the unsupervised model, which does the predictions and learns to become a better predictor. And then you use this planner to plan into the future and then select action sequences that lead to situations with high predicted reward according to this world model. And this is basically what we published in 25 years ago.
This is actually from the late 60s, right? It's classical, I mean, early 60s.
But not with recurrent neural networks. And then the problem, of course, is if you want to have a sequence that spans a long time lag, for example, going from here to Beijing, you don't want to simulate that millisecond by millisecond. Instead, you want to figure out these relevant sub-goals. So
Absolutely.
you first go to the taxi station, then you go to the airport, and so on. And for a long time, nothing happens. And now I think there are much better ways of exploiting this knowledge in the prediction machine, which do not require this millisecond by millisecond simulation of the future.
I never advocated for millisecond by millisecond.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I entirely agree that the prediction should have multiple time scales.
And you can learn it. That's a good thing.
And should be hierarchical and should be learned. Yeah, we completely agree on that.